Hello and welcome to Lesson 7 of this online humanities course. In this lesson we'll be looking at Albert Camus and his work The Stranger, and we'll be looking at Existentialism, a literary and philosophical movement, occurs around the 1950s. And afterwards we'll be looking at Postmodernity and Postmodernism, Postmodern Art. We'll be discussing what Postmodernism is as opposed to modernism, and we'll be discussing that through Lyotard and his question, what is postmodernity? So let's get started. So part one, we have existentialism here, a number of famous existentialists throughout history. We have Martin Heidegger, Simone de Beauvoir, we have Albert Camus, Franz Kafka, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Jaspers, Sartre, Marcel, Kierkegaard, and others. So what is existentialism in the first place? It's a philosophical, literary, and also an artistic movement, and in many ways it considers the human condition, questions of human meaning and existence, as the key philosophical problem. In many ways we've already encountered existentialism in the work of Viktor Frankl and his man's search for meaning. We saw that he applies existentialism within the domain of psychotherapy to study suffering in human existence, and he argues that a lot of the neuroses and mental illnesses that human beings experience are caused by loss of meaning and can be resolved by kind of coming back into a recognition of what is meaningful in life. So we'll be looking at existentialism within the context of literature within this lesson in Camus, The Stranger. So the themes of existentialism then are death and anxiety, authenticity, in other words, being an authentic human being or living authentically, the question of freedom, and freedom is here understood as the ability to create one's path in life. It's not so much a political freedom. Historicity, in other words, human existence as having a particular history and as being bound to its history, and so we interpret our world from the perspective of the culture and the world in which we grow up from within, which has its own history tied to it. We have human existence, of course, in other words, the fact of our being in a world, and we have questions of meaning and absurdity, the fact that, well, in some ways it seems that we could say that existence itself doesn't seem to be really meaningful from a certain perspective, or we can say that, well, that search for meaning, perhaps there is no meaning, in which case it seems that there's a certain absurdity tied to human existence. There's notions of the crowd and the other, for example. These are notions that come out in the works of, for example, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who talks about the other as kind of someone who imposes itself upon us, an other that stares into our soul, an other that we can kind of not shake off, who sees us, who we can't really hide from. Right? So these are all different themes. So there are a number of existentialists that we can talk about. I kind of listed them before. There's Søren Kierkegaard and his Fear and Trembling. I kind of mentioned him earlier, I believe I did, in an earlier lesson when we talked about Goethe and the possible responses for Werther in relation to the seeking the infinite. And Kierkegaard talks about the response of that leap of faith, and we're going to talk about that today when we look at Camus. There's Friedrich Nietzsche on the genealogy of morals, very famous work about the history of morality and how we develop our notions of good and bad. There's Martin Heidegger's famous book, Being in Time, in which he talks about the fact that human existence, in many ways, the way our own encounter with existence as human beings helps us to define what it means to be. There's Jean-Paul Sartre and his Being in Nothingness, where he talks about the notions of the other, as I've mentioned. There's Simone de Beauvoir, a famous French existentialist and feminist philosopher, who has a wonderful book, The Second Sex, in which she talks about, well, the existential life of the other that is female in this case. And then we have Dostoevsky, which the Camus should be removed there. And we have his Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov, which are very famous books which deal with existentialist themes. So let's talk about then Albert Camus, who lived in 1913 to 1960. He was a very famous French journalist and mostly a writer, editor, playwright, director, novelist, political essayist, activist, and philosopher, although in many ways he would have denied the title of philosopher for various reasons, which we'll talk about. His two important works for this class, the one is The Myth of Sisyphus, which is more of a kind of philosophical essay written in 1942, which discusses the absurdity of existence. In other words, the fact that, well, we encounter existence from the perspective of seeking meaning, and for Camus, the problem is that, well, existence doesn't seem to really offer any kind of meaningful response. And so he says that absurdity results from this, okay? We'll talk about this a bit more. We have also The Stranger, which is a novel which portrays absurdity in a literary context through a man who is condemned of murder. So it's a great novel, and please make sure you read that. So although Camus is considered an existentialist historically, he separated himself from mainstream existentialism. So he also denied the title of being a philosopher for the very reason that he really denies any kind of affiliation with something like trying to present a systematic philosophy of the world. Now, when we talk about the nature of postmodernism, we're going to see that many of the postmodernists will do the same thing. They will kind of attempt to deny any kind of rational, unifying account of reality. And we'll see that actually Camus, who kind of denies the position of existentialist, in many ways he's kind of looking forward from modernity, within which existentialism is situated, toward postmodernity, where this kind of push from unity to plurality, or from identity to differences and differentiation, becomes one of the major themes within postmodernism. So what we see is with many of the postmodernists, Camus will have little faith in reason's capacity to know the truth, and so Camus will often make use of metaphor and stories for the purpose of conveying meaning. He was also very concerned or interested with the immediate question question of human existence, and with our immediate and personal experiences. And so in talking about the absurd, what he basically wants to say is, well, this is kind of the primary type of encounter, the most primordial, the most fundamental encounter that we have. It's with this notion of the absurd. And here we have the Myth of Sisyphus. Now, you'll be watching a very short video about that. You might want to pause this video if you haven't seen that video yet, and just watch that. It's a very short 2-minute video about the Myth of Sisyphus, recounted from Camus, the perspective of Camus in his book. All right. So I'm just going to give a little synopsis of that. And here I say to make sure you watch it. So the Myth of Sisyphus, then, within this work, Camus talks about or expresses the idea of absurdity through a metaphor, indeed through a myth. And it's the myth of Sisyphus, who is within ancient Greek poetry and the ancient Greek myths, is a man who is condemned by the gods, basically to Hades, to the kind of Greek hell. And he's condemned to push a rock up a mountain for eternity. And every time that he reaches the top, the rock falls or tumbles back down, and he's forced to repeat that process, and the process is in fact indefinite, so it's kind of his eternal condemnation. And what Camus wants to say, remember again this is kind of a metaphor or an analogy, he says, well, it's a kind of analogy to our own existence. Every day we wake up and we go to work, and we apply through our labors each day just to get food on our table, and the next day we get up and we do the same thing, and eventually, well, we just die, and it seems that there's really no larger meaning within human life. In some way, we're kind of like ants that go about and build build the ants or bees who build the hive, and kind of they just die thereafter, and for no purpose but just to serve the hive itself, it seems. So within the book, he gives possible responses to this kind of absurd life that human beings seem to have. And the first one is faith, or that leap of faith, the one that I mentioned with Kierkegaard. And so faith becomes a possible response because in seeing this absurdity in life, the fact that we awaken each day, that we're forced to work, and eventually we just die, well, in seeing this, we can encounter the infinite and reach out toward the infinite and there find God and kind of embrace faith in God as a way out of the absurdity of our existence. And so, as I said, Soren Kierkegaard speaks of this in his Fear and Trembling, and he talks about the story, the biblical Old Testament story of Abraham and Isaac. And it's interesting to think about that story, because in the story we see that God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And what we find in that story is an interesting parallel here, because the command itself is absurd. It's an absurd command because, well, God is good, and why would God command Abraham to do something which was fundamentally, well, in many ways, evil or wrong, to sacrifice his own son? Why would he ask him that? And so, of course, in the story, the biblical story, we find that actually God is testing Abraham's faith. God is seeing, to what extent is Abraham attached to this mortal life, and to what extent is he willing to sacrifice it for his love of God. So in the end, we see, of course, that God holds Abraham's hand back and calls upon him to stop right before sacrificing his son, and a lamb is presented for him to sacrifice instead. So what we see is that Abraham is forced to confront the absurdity of a good God who commands him to do something which, well, seems contrary to a good God. And there's the absurdity. Yet he has faith. You see, he takes that leap of faith and he says, God is good, and he will present an alternative. And he goes through with the act until the very last moment, in which God actually comes and fulfills the hope that he has in God. Okay? Now, what we're going to see is that Camus actually rejects this response because he was himself an atheist. So a second response is that of negation. Okay? So negation, then, is a form of nihilism. In other words, the second response is saying no to existence. And nihilism involves denying value entirely. So what it is that in seeing that, well, there's this absurdity in our existence, that it doesn't seem like life is meaningful, the nihilist would be one who says, well, life is simply meaningless and that's it. And so what the nihilist does is completely rejects all possible meaning in life, and indeed the complete end of nihilism is one's own self-annihilation and through suicide. Okay? And what we see is this was a kind of response that we saw within Goethe's Werther, where Werther himself, who loved Charlotte but was unable to obtain her in the end. So this is a kind of analogy to existence, that human beings live their lives, and yet in finding no meaning, okay, the nihilist would be one who says, well, life is just not worth living, and so they end their life on account of that. So Camus talks about this, and he says that this is a form of, it's a kind of pseudo-response, okay? So it's not an authentic response. And he says the reason is that people kill themselves for various reasons, and some of them are meaningful. For example, one can commit a kind of suicide by giving up one's life for another, okay? Or they can kill themselves for a higher ideal, for example, suggesting that in killing another one will reach heaven. You see, the kind of suicidal act. And so Camus again calls this a kind of pseudo-response, and he says it's a failure to recognize life's true or authentic possibilities. So there's that word, authentic. And we abandon hope in eternity and see nothing else. So remember, Camus is indeed atheist, but he sees in theism or an act or a leap of faith an authentic response, because indeed there could be a God and he could be wrong. He sees in suicide, however, an inauthentic response, and he suggests this because he says even in atheism you can find meaning. But how is he going to do this? And this leads to the third possible response. And so the third response is that of affirmation, and you can add to this in your notes, affirmation and rebellion. And this was really Camus' view. He actually writes a book, The Rebel, which is more of a political essay, but it does include his absurdist notions and his response of affirmation and rebellion to the absurdity of existence. So according to him, just because life is meaningless, that doesn't mean we need to reject life entirely. Rather, what we can is rebel against this meaningless in life, and so affirm life. And in doing so, we create our own meaning. We make our lives meaningful. So, and I note here, what you want to see is the connection to what Mill suggests, John Stuart Mill in his book on liberty, on the chapter on individualism, which hopefully you've read. So what Mill says about individualism is that, well, we should be free to create our own path in life, and that governments should allow us that freedom. So what Camus is doing is kind of taking this to an entirely more fundamental level, and he's saying that no matter what, regardless of how meaningless existence may be, human beings, as aware and self-conscious, are free to create meaning within their own lives. So again, you're going to want to think of this within the context of postmodernism, which we'll talk about, because we'll talk about the notion of a narrative in postmodernism. And in modernism, which is prior to this, modernism kind of seeks these grand narratives so that when we look at something like existence, we say, well, a modernist response would be to say, well, existence must have a grand meaning, or if it doesn't, it has a grand meaninglessness. And what Camus wants to say is, look, we should stop looking for this grand narrative and instead focus on the small narrative of our everyday individual existence. Instead of trying to find some grand meaning in life, simply create meaning in your individual existence and the existence of those around you. So he sees a very different view there. Okay, so what I'm going to look at now is The Stranger, his great work of literature, which you'll be reading. Here, I have a little picture here to kind of illustrate this. Again, I'm going to be going over this book just in summary, and you'll be reading it, and in your projects, I may ask questions in relation to this, okay, rather than the essays. So here we have the main character of the book is Marceau, who is a French Algerian, in other words, a Frenchman living in North Africa. The book itself is told from a first-person perspective. In other words, the main character, Marceau, is actually narrates the story. There's two parts, so the work is divided into two parts, which is before and after the murder. And here we have Camus actually gives a kind of little summary discussion of the main topic or plot of the book, and he says that, well, I summarized The Stranger a long time ago with a remark I admit was highly paradoxical. And so he says, in our society, any man who does not weep at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced to death. And he says, I only meant that the hero of my book is condemned because he does not play the game. Okay? And so what is The Stranger then going to be about? So what you're going to read is about a man who, as the novel begins, his mother dies, and he just seems to have no reaction to it. And throughout the book, you'll notice that his reactions of indifference, okay, are kind of consistent, but also lead him down a dangerous path. And only toward the end does he start to become aware of this kind of indifference that he has, but then it's too late, okay? And so the main point that Camus is making here is that, well, what Marceau is going to be condemned for is really going to be for that indifference that he has toward existence, and because there's something, according to Camus, which is ultimately reprehensible. So in a way, what Marceau is he's this kind of nihilistic man who simply kind of denies any meaning in life and just takes his pleasures in the present moment. And so for Camus, of course, who saw the third option of rebellion and affirmation as an authentic option, and the second option of kind of denial and nihilism as an inauthentic option, we're going to see that, well, there's something about Marceau that deserves condemnation from the perspective of his very existence itself, the way he lives, the way he has created himself, all right? So the plot here, and I'll just go over it again, the main plot of the novel revolves around Marceau, a regular man, just a normal everyday man who is informed of his mother's death. And while attending the funeral, he meets a woman, Marie, and has a romantic affair. He later meets up with a man, Raymond Sintez, who has a fight with his girlfriend, and the girlfriend's brother, who is called the Arab, follows the main characters around throughout the novel. Eventually, events take a downward turn, and Marceau ends up killing the Arab, shooting him. Marceau is eventually condemned for murder, but here's the catch. He's never really condemned for killing the man that he actually murders. Okay, so there's the interesting twist in the plot. So, some main points to look for, and again, you're going to have to read the book and find those interpretive items. Okay, I'm just going to give you some main points here, right? So part one, the main points. The first one is you want to think about that indifference that Marceau has at his mother's death and funeral. You know, what does that say about his way of life, the way he looks at things? You know, what is he missing in life that his mother... Now, he doesn't have a bad relationship with his mother. From the perspective of the story, it seems that, well, his relationship was always fine. Maybe it wasn't the best relationship, the most loving, because he seems to be kind of incapable of expressing true love. But there's an indifference there, and why does that really condemn him? What is that? The second point is the way he conducts his relationships with others, with Marie and with Raymond, which shows that he lives for the moment and cares for nothing. Again, what does that say about Marceau himself? You'll see that his boss offers him a position which is something which would be desirable, and yet Marceau kind of turns it down, showing that he really lacks ambition in life. Again, this is a commentary on the man's character, on his general view on how he's conducting his life. And finally, you'll want to note in the first part the way he kills the Arab man with such indifference, almost like he's looking at the man as just an object that really has no value. So what is that kind of devaluation of existence that Marceau is showing throughout the novel? And so, again, you're going to want to think from the perspective of this nihilism, this kind of complete denial of meaning in life. So, in part two, a few main points to look for as well. We see that his arrest, and we're going to see the investigator who interrogates him is going to be shocked at Marceau's disbelief, that he believes in absolutely nothing. Now remember, Camus was an atheist, so in a way Camus didn't believe in anything either, but he paints a picture of the investigator as being really authentically shocked at Marceau, and there is something shocking at his complete lack of belief. Okay, and so you want to think about how does that kind of compose Marceau's whole view. Finally, consider his original feelings about being in jail. So when he's first jailed, notice what he says about his life in jail. He doesn't seem to really mind. He's like, well, I can just go about my everyday life, except I'm a little more confined, right? And notice at the trial, the prosecution never brings up the fact of the murder itself, okay? And so what you start to see is that he's actually not on trial for the murder of the Arab man. He's on trial for indifference at his mother's death, and indeed indifference to existence, right? And notice the final condemnation and Marceau's growing awareness and anxiety over his impending death. Okay, so these are very important points that toward the end Marceau begins to wake up and realize, you know, something. My mother died, I killed the Arab man, and he starts to realize people are dying, and then he starts to see, wait a minute, I'm going to die, you see? And so that awakening, okay, and you can kind of think of Viktor Frankl when he talks about the men in the concentration camp and how they respond to that recognition of death, and how some respond with just complete indifference and they end up dying, whereas others who find meanings somehow carry on. So there's an interesting analogy here. So here's some interpretive elements. So one of the main interpretations of the novel is that it's about, of course, this existence, death, and absurdity and meaning as well. Okay, so there's nothing really surprising there. So Meursault, though, is an indifferent man and a pleasure seeker, right? He's indifferent to his mother's death, to relationships, to murder, even to jail. And throughout the story, he awakens. Now, this is what you want to recognize, and make sure as you read the book, you keep these interpretive elements in mind. Notice how there's this progression throughout the novel in terms of Meursault's recognition and awareness of death, where he's completely indifferent to the fact that, he's mortal and other persons are mortal, and that other persons have value, and that even he has value, to the recognition toward the end that he is going to die, you see? So it's a transformation. Notice that as he holds the gun, he realizes that he can kill the Arab men. So make sure you read that part when he's about to kill the Arab men. There's an awakening there. And notice after the condemnation that he realizes that he will die, and it completely alters the way he experiences his imprisonment. And so the idea here is that Meursault is like us. He's basically the office worker who gets up and goes to work every day, or the person in the factory, or at the fast food restaurant, right? Or at work, teaching, or going to school as a student. We wake up, we go through our life, and for the most part, we're completely indifferent. And what Camus wants to say is that somehow, the indifference condemns us. That not only does it condemn us, but we are condemned from the very moment we're born, because we will ultimately die. But the deeper guilt, is when we completely fail to realize that this fact of our mortality, because in doing so, we live our life indifferently, and we lose the opportunity to truly live our lives, you see, to make our lives into something meaningful. And this is the whole point, let's say the deeper point of the novel. So again, as you're reading the novel, think about these interpretive points, but also think about some other interpretive perspectives and any novel perspectives that you might have, and I welcome any interpretations that you might have, especially when we start looking at the essay later on. So let's get into part 2 of the lecture here. And we're going to talk about Postmodernity. And here we have a painting by Rothko, which is Untitled, 1939. An interesting painting here. So first I'm going to talk about Jean-Francois Lyotard, 1924 to 1998, a French philosopher and art critic. And here's a picture of him. So he's a French philosopher, sociologist, literary, and artistic critic, and he was considered at the time as one of the world's foremost postmodernist thinkers. In his works, he covers a variety of topics such as the postmodern condition and the nature of modernity, what modernity is and how postmodernity is different from that. He talks about modernist and postmodernist art and knowledge, the nature of communication, how we're communicating today. For example, in a postmodern world, the nature of our language and how we make use of language, how language is controlled, right? How language becomes a kind of powerful medium that can be used. For example, we talk about politically correct and incorrect speech. And the nature of narratives, right? These grand narratives and smaller narratives that can be used to explain meaning or meaningfulness in life. So what you'll be reading is it's the appendix to his larger work, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, and I've kind of uploaded that e-text. It's only available in e-text online, so you want to make sure you get that. It's in the e-text links in the introductory part of the course. Make sure you read that. It's a short selection from the book. It's going to be a little difficult to understand, so make sure you just review this. If you have any difficulties, review what I talk about here, and just use this as a basis for understanding what he's saying there. So the work is essentially, as I say, an attack on modernity, what modernism is, kind of modernism, which you can say really initiates some, let's say, with the post-impressionists or even the impressionists in the 1870s or so, and kind of is carried off until the end of World War II, let's say around 1945. And around 1950 or so, that's when, to about 1980s, that's when postmodernism kind of comes about in art and literature and philosophy, etc. So it's essentially an attack on modernity, And the idea is that modernity sought a kind of unity of human experience. Okay, seeks to answer fundamental questions. Why is life meaningful? You see this, for example, even in Viktor Frankl a bit. It makes use of grand or meta-narratives, as I've spoken of, where we have philosophical accounts, for example, of human history as a progression toward a final goal. In other words, a grand narrative about human history could say, well, human history, this is something that, for example, Hegel, the great philosopher, German philosopher, offers. He says that human history is this progression towards self-awareness. And you can kind of think of the internet as this kind of uber-awareness, this kind of localized domain where the human beings kind of all come together in terms of communication, and where we have this dawning of this higher consciousness. See, that's a modern interpretation because we're trying to find a complete unity to human existence. Okay, so postmodernism will attack this and say, look, these things, this is baloney. That these types of unities, these types of systematic unities of human experience don't exist. Human beings experience in piecemeal fashion. There's differences that can't be mediated sometimes. There are chaotic elements to things that can't be put into the whole, you see? And so within the postmodernists will tend to dismiss individual events in preference for the whole. This would be the modernists. And the modernists ignore chaos and chance events that cannot be included within the larger narrative that they talk about. So the basic idea there is that a modernist, for example, a modernist historian, would explain certain historical events, such as you could say the French Revolution, and they'll exclude things that don't fit into the whole picture, things that contradict their story. You see, that would be a modernist explanation. Whereas a postmodernist explanation of something like the French Revolution would say, look, we can't quite explain all the reasons for the French Revolution. We can give some larger reasons and some smaller reasons. Some are not going to make complete sense, but they're still reasons, you see? Okay, and also one of the ideas of the postmodern attack is that a lot of these modernist systems will be based upon these power structures, okay, a kind of will to power to control, for example, history by giving a wholesale systematic account of what happened. Okay, there's a kind of a will to power underlining this kind of attempt to completely explain history and give an account of it. Okay, so the basic idea is that we should replace these with smaller narratives. That's the postmodernist perspective. Okay, now let's get into modern art. All right. So Lyotard's account of postmodernism is useful in terms of understanding how art changes from modern art, in other words, from Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, even Abstractionism, into the types of modern art, postmodern art, that we're going to start to see and talk about. Because with modern art, what we're going to see is that even though there's this change where the modern artists start to move away from depicting classical forms like trees and people and stuff and start using more abstract forms, the modern artists are still stuck on certain conventions that come from the classical world. For example, modern artists, they'll seek harmony, even disharmony, but the disharmony that modern art seeks, for example, the abstract paintings, you can have a disharmony there, but there's still something harmonious about this disharmony within modern abstract works of art. Okay, so one of the things that's important here is in modern art is that they attempt to, put forward the unpresentable through the medium of form. This is actually Lyotard's expression, his account of abstractionism. What does that mean? It means if we think about Kandinsky and his works, Kandinsky is trying to paint ideas, right, or concepts, or feelings that are abstract. That's the unpresentable. The unpresentable is a concept. You can't present a concept directly. You can't say sort of put a picture of a concept, because a concept doesn't have a picture, right? But you can try to present it through art, kind of through metaphor, symbol, you see? And this is what abstractionism in modern art attempts to do. Now what happens, though, is that in modern art, all the way up into abstractionism, they still retain these classical norms of beauty. So the works of these artists are always beautiful at some point, and that's kind of the ideal they're looking for. They also conform to the classical modes that should say of expression of art. For example, the modern artists, they make use of the classical modes of sculpture, painting, okay, etchings, etc. Okay, so they don't really explore other media, okay, which you're going to see in postmodern art. Another point is that they conform to the moral standards of taste. So, for example, you have to depict certain things which are morally upstanding. You shouldn't, for example, depict religious icons in a sacrilegious way. Well, with postmodernism, a lot of the artists are going to start to kind of defy those moral standards and use art as a way of kind of exploiting our moral conventions, right? So postmodern art, then, we can see it by opposition, seeks, in a way, disharmony, certainly at the very early stage, where you have something like Dadaism. We saw that with Duchamp, where they kind of directly attack certain moral standards of art. And here's, again, the expression of Lyotard. In postmodern art, what they seek to do is they put forward the unpresentable through the mode of presentation itself. So what does that mean? So the postmodern artist is working within the abstract, within the confines, in a way, of abstractionism, where they're trying to express ideas, concepts, thoughts, feelings, etc. But now they're not just trying to express them through painting, right? They're taking art and they're changing the way they express things by exploring different modes of presentation. For example, postmodern artists will make use of something like installations, which we'll see, or they'll start going out in the street and start painting on walls, okay, real, genuine artists. Or they'll start manipulating things like large formations, or what's called earthworks, and we'll see this. So in other words, what they do is they kind of move out of the museum as the place for expressing art, or move out of the modes of drawing and painting as the only way in which we can actually produce art. Okay, so this opens up certain things like, for example, art, digital art, etc. So it opens up new forms of art, and in a way it was kind of necessary for this transition to happen. They also go beyond the classical norms of beauty, and so a lot of these artists start to intentionally present things that are ugly and distasteful. So why not? Why can't the ugly be something artistic? So what does that mean there? It means that art is not about expressing beautiful things. Art is something else. It's about expressing the human soul. And the human soul can be ugly sometimes, right? Or vicious or distasteful. And so what they do is they break the moral norms of classical expression as well. So they start to actually present things which are sacrilegious in nature as a way of intentionally expressing themselves through art, right? We won't really be looking at that. We'll be looking at the other modes of presentation. So here's just a final quote from Lyotard, where he kind of defines postmodernism, and he says that postmodernism is the rejection of the idea that there can be a single coherent rationality, or that reality has a unitary nature that can be definitively observed or understood. So just keep that definition in mind when you look at this art. Okay, so let's look at some postmodernism about 1945 to the present. So here again, just a kind of opposition of modernism and postmodernism. We see modernism about 1890 1945, postmodernism to the present afterwards. The first, we see modernism was critical of the bourgeois social order initially of the 19th century and its worldview, and it really begins with Impressionism. On the other hand, postmodernism, the term dates back to John Watkins Chapman in the 1870s, who referred to a postmodern style of painting that differed from Impressionism, okay, and he calls it postmodern. With modernism, we have the attempt to construct a logical, scientific, rational, coherent account of the world, again, identity. With postmodernism, we emphasize the unscientific, irrational thought processes and the removal of differences, okay? Well, not necessarily the removal of differences, but the breaking down of unity into differences. And then also one of the interesting points in this differentiation is modernism generally kind of emphasized European Western thought, and one of the changes which radically affects art, of course, is globalization. And with globalization, artists are going to be more are going to become ever more influenced by different types of art that come from different cultures, such as Asian and African, etc. We saw this already, for example, even with the Impressionists, who were influenced by Japanese, a lot of the Japanese painters and artists. So we see it's going to be based, postmodernism will, in many ways will be based on multicultural approaches. And finally, we see in the modernism, it believes in learning from past experience and trusts the texts that narrate the past. And we see that postmodernism, because they kind of see these power structures, especially feminism, will start to say, well, look, there's these power structures which allow certain classes of individuals to have kind of a ruling hegemony over others, okay, or authority over others. And so what happens in postmodernism, they start to become suspicious of these larger narratives and start to push more of these smaller contextual narratives, right? So what we see then is a kind of paradigm shift, okay, that starts to occur within art. We see that mass production and photography lead to fundamental changes in the way in which people start to view art and make art. That mirror images require little different skills. Copies, for example, a photocopier machine, create loss or blurring of originality, whereas we look at, for example, classical works, we have a single painting on canvas that really can't be copied without the loss of value. And we see also in making copies or digital expressions of images that somehow we get now this instantaneous expression, and art becomes now reproducible. So this kind of changes or alters the way in which we start to view what art is. Kind of that concrete aspect of art, even that becomes more abstract, and so that art itself takes on a more abstract nature, even if in its mode of expression. Okay. And here we have modernism in art, just kind of a quick review of what we've seen already. Okay, so we have Picasso, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, some names. We had Cubism, okay, which we looked at. Okay, this kind of push toward abstractionism. Okay, Pointillism, okay, this emphasis on technique in the production of the work, this emphasis on color, okay, and how the color is going to be put upon the canvas. Okay, and of course, then we see this push now. This early push in modern art into postmodern art. We have Dadaism, another example of Dadaism. There we have Duchamp's example of the fountain. We have Hannah Hawk with the Dada kitchen knife. And we have Surrealism, René Magritte. This is one we didn't see. This actually says, the painting reads, "This is not a pipe." So another example of Surrealism, a very interesting picture, because what it shows is kind of the nature of art, that somehow by putting the pipe on display and saying that this is not a pipe, what it does is it puts into perspective what art is doing, okay? It's pretty much what Duchamp was doing with his work, The Fountain. So here we have this initial movement, abstract expressionism. This is Jackson Pollock. You watched a video on Pollock earlier, okay, and on his experiences, a very interesting man. Pollock, he was inspired in part by the automatic techniques of the Surrealists. Remember the automatism, where the Surrealists would just kind of allow their subconsciousness to take over as they painted. So Pollock began to drip paint onto canvases laid flat on the floor, and the poured paintings demonstrated revolutionary concepts of composition, artistic prowess, and the creative process, along with establishing a viable new role for risk and spontaneity in the visual arts. And we have then pop art. So we have to recall that one of the fundamental changes to art is that art starts to become reproducible, and of course the media and these media images start to influence our way of life, and so artists can start to make a commentary on this. We see here some of the popular images of Andy Warhol. We have, of course, Marilyn Monroe, the picture, everyone should be familiar with that, Mickey Mouse, and the Campbell's tomato soup, sort of commentary on popular scenes within our experience, on cartoons and on advertising, right? Here we have Liechtenstein, a girl with a mirror, enamel on steel, another example of pop art. So he, with Warhol, challenges traditional notions of the subject matter and appearance of fine art by embracing everyday subjects, like we see. Okay? So here's an example of installation which I had mentioned. This becomes a way in which postmodern artists start to manipulate the mode of presentation. So now they're not, you see, we see here, this is an example of minimalism as well. Minimalism being kind of trying to minimalize what we're making use of and expressing for the purpose of expressing something more contextual or conceptual. Here we have Dan Flavin. And so what we see is the sculptures here have a physical aspect, the fixtures and the tubes, but they also focus our attention on the use of light itself as a means to impact the space. We see that the light from the bulbs, which are commonly used in offices, stores, and homes, take on a new significance, like the pipe, which is placed on canvas, or the print, okay, in which it says this is not a pipe, and in the form of sculpture on the walls of an art gallery. Okay, so again, that mode of presentation, the entire room now becomes the work of art. Very different from taking a painting and just putting it in a museum, right? So that would be an installation. Okay. Here's a very interesting work. This is called Conceptual Art. It's by Joseph Kosuth, 1965. His 1 and 3 chairs. It has a very philosophical import as well, if you really think about it. So what it's doing is that what he's actually presenting in the work is 3 ways of presenting or viewing the same concept or object, which is the chair. So we see on the left, we see a painting of a chair, okay, actually a photograph of a chair. And then in the middle, we see an actual chair, and on the right, a definition of a chair. And so in some way, each of these ways of presenting the chair represent or kind of display chairness in some way. So there's something very fundamentally philosophical there for anyone who's familiar or has taken a philosophy course. For example, Plato, the great ancient Greek philosopher, talks about the idea of a chair or the idea of a human being and suggests that somehow that idea or notion of chair or humanness or dogness, for example, has more reality than the individuals, because the individuals, they pass away and they possess the attributes of it, but the humanness or the dogness or treeness, that kind of remains and is eternal. And somehow this is a kind of similar commentary on that. Here we have an example of an earthwork. This is Robert Smithson, Spiral Jetty, 69 to 70, okay, made with various earthen materials. Okay, so again, that mode of presentation is changing. Okay, we don't have artists going out with their painting and their canvas and easel. We have an actual, almost a grand construction here of art. Here's an example of some feminist art. We have Judy Chicago, the dinner part, which should say party there. And each place setting here represents a major influential female figure, real and mythical, throughout history. Another example here is a commentary on identity, race, and ethnicity. We have Carrie James Marshall. This is called Many Mansions, a very interesting painting here, acrylic on paper. Depicts a visual essay on life in public housing projects like those in Alabama and California, where the artist himself grew up. So again, you look at a picture like this, and so notice how the themes start to present something like more postmodernist notions, okay, where we have a discussion of such things as race and ethnicity, discussion of something like power structures that yield something like feminist art, okay. We see that these juxtaposition of images, okay, it almost takes out of something like surrealism and it presents it in a different context, okay, because the commentary here is not about the subconsciousness, but it's about certain structures, about certain class relations, about experiences from certain persons and individuals and groups, right? Okay, and here we have, this is going to be Bansky, the great artist today, and it's usually called street art, but this is a good example of art now within the 21st century and how postmodernism has influenced this. So Bansky is actually a pseudonym for a British artist. I believe he's still unknown. He might be, who has gone into various countries, into various cities, including New York and in the UK, and he often puts his works straight on the street. You see here on the walls of buildings, etc. His works actually have, but he's become very famous, and his works can go for $1 million. For example, that work there, the green building there, the no loitering sign on this kind of run-down building. Just that piece alone you'd actually have to put a guard in front of that to keep people from stealing it, because that you could get $1 million. So you'd actually be very lucky if Bansky came and painted graffiti on your house. That's how famous he's become. So Bansky's a very interesting artist, and a lot of his works have this kind of symbolic value where he's commenting on contemporary life. Here's an interesting final example here of postmodern art in comparison to something like Impressionism and modern art. So we see Monet, the great Impressionist painting, who in his water lilies, painting of a pond, notice how, yes, there's that Impressionist aspect where he's focusing on light and reflection, but there's beauty in that work. And then we see a postmodernist work, something like Bansky and his water lilies. Notice how he's taking Monet's painting and he's putting it into an entirely different postmodernist context, where he's now painting something which is indeed distasteful. You see, it's pollution. And so the reason is that and this becomes art, and you can ask the question, well, how is it art? It's art because art transcends those classical norms of beauty and expression and tries to express something deeper in the human soul. In this case, it's a commentary, on how we're kind of treating our world.